In 1992, a struggling clothing company with no clear identity gave a single man nearly unlimited power to reinvent it. What he built over the next 2 decades became one of the most dominant and most controversial retail empires in American history. Walk into an Abercrombie Fitch store at its peak in the early 2000s, and the experience was deliberate, total, and overwhelming. The louvers on the windows blocked out daylight. The music pounded at 90 decibels, the level of heavy construction machinery. The signature cologne, Fierce, was pumped so heavily through the ventilation that shoppers could identify the store from the corridor of the mall before they even turned the corner. At the entrance stood a shirtless male model, young, muscled, selected specifically for his appearance, whose job was not to sell clothing, but to embody the fantasy of what wearing it might feel like. By 2006, Abercrombie Fitch had achieved 52 consecutive quarters of rising earnings. That is 13 unbroken years of growth. Annual revenues topped $2 billion. The brand had 800 stores and operated 3 additional sub-brands. Teenagers in 40 countries wore its logo as a social credential. Then something went catastrophically wrong. A 7-year-old interview resurfaced. A cascade of lawsuits arrived. The cool kids stopped coming. Sales fell for 18 consecutive quarters. The CEO who had built the empire resigned in disgrace in 2014. And then, years later, he was arrested. Today, the man who transformed Abercrombie Fitch from a bankrupt outfitter into a billion-dollar youth brand faces federal charges of sex trafficking and prostitution. So how does the story of a 133-year-old company go from equipping Theodore Roosevelt's African safari to a federal criminal indictment? Rise, dominance, collapse, and reckoning. This is the dark story of Abercrombie & Fitch. Welcome inside the brand that once ruled youth fashion and the price it paid for how it got there. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. This is one of the most layered, complicated, and genuinely shocking stories in the history of American retail. It goes places most brand stories never go. Let's get into it. June 4th, 1892, Lower Manhattan, New York City. David T. Abercrombie was not a merchant by nature. He was a man of the outdoors, a former civil engineer, a wilderness surveyor who had worked in the rugged coal and timber country of West Virginia for the Norfolk and Western Railroad. A man who had spent enough time in demanding outdoor environments to develop a profound and permanent frustration with the poor quality of the gear available to people who actually worked in them. He had ideas. He had connections to manufacturers. He had a small waterfront shop at 36 South Street in downtown Manhattan, where, in 1992, he began selling precisely the kind of equipment he had always wished existed. Premium tents, exceptional fishing rods, firearms of careful quality, camping supplies built for professional use in the field rather than casual weekend excursions. His clients were the people who needed this gear the way a craftsman needs his tools. Seriously, practically, without sentimentality. One of those clients was Ezra Fitch. Fitch was everything Abercrombie was not by temperament. A successful lawyer from Kingston, New York, a real estate developer, an outdoorsman by passion rather than profession, he had a visionary's restlessness and a wealthy man's willingness to act on large ideas. He became one of the store's most devoted customers. Then, in 1900, he purchased a significant interest in the growing company, and by 1904, the partnership was formally incorporated as Abercrombie & Fitch Company. The two men disagreed about almost everything. Abercrombie wanted to serve serious, professional outdoorsmen exclusively, a narrow, premium, integrity-driven market. Fitch wanted to expand the brand to attract the broader American elite, anyone wealthy enough to want adventure and sophisticated enough to pay for the gear to pursue it. The arguments were long and violent. In 1907, Abercrombie sold his shares and returned to manufacturing. Fitch proceeded alone, and what he proceeded to build was extraordinary. In 1909, Fitch mailed 50,000 copies of a 456-page catalogue across the world. Each catalogue cost $1 to produce. They nearly bankrupted the company. But the flood of orders that followed justified every penny. Abercrombie Fitch equipped Theodore Roosevelt's African safari. It outfitted Charles Lindbergh for his historic transatlantic flight in 1927. It supplied Admiral Richard Byrd's expedition to Antarctica. Ernest Hemingway was a regular customer. The gun with which Hemingway took his own life in 1961 had been purchased from Abercrombie Fitch. By 1929, net sales reached $6.3 million, a record that reflected the company's position at the exact intersection of American ambition and American wealth. It was, without question, the greatest sporting goods store in the world. Then, the Depression arrived, and then the culture changed, and the company was not nimble enough to keep up with either. The 1960s, New York City. The America that had bought its expedition gear from Abercrombie Fitch, the America of colonial safaris and transatlantic aviation records and Antarctic exploration, was giving way to something new: flower power, environmental consciousness, an entire generation looking at mounted animal heads and stuffed dead animals in a high-end Manhattan storefront and seeing not adventure, but the wrong values at the wrong time. The company tried to adapt. Under a succession of presidents who had neither Fitch's vision nor Abercrombie's operational precision, management attempted to broaden the merchandise base, add less expensive items, and move into suburban locations where American consumers were increasingly doing their shopping. One advertising man described the company's management as ossified. The first television commercials, when they finally aired in 1969, filled the store, but with precisely the wrong customers. The people who showed up were not, according to company leadership at the time, the kind of customer Abercrombie Fitch wanted. This was, perhaps, the first sign of a pattern that would define the brand through multiple eras, the conviction that some customers belonged and others did not. The finances deteriorated steadily throughout the early 1970s. The company had maintained its identity as a purveyor of lavish items, an $18,000 gold and onyx chess set being among the more striking examples, at a moment when high operating expenses made such inventory increasingly unviable. The solution the company chose was to cut inventory, but cutting from the top was followed by cutting from the middle, until the stores became neither aspirational nor accessible. In 1976, Abercrombie Fitch filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. In 1977, the flagship store on Madison Avenue at East 45th Street, the store that had outfitted presidents and explorers and Nobel laureates, closed permanently. In 1978, a Houston-based sporting goods chain called Oshman's Sporting Goods purchased the company's name and mailing list from the bankruptcy proceedings for $1.5 million. $1.5 million for the name of a company whose catalogue had reached 50,000 recipients worldwide in 1909. Oshman's relaunched the brand as a mail-order hunting wear retailer. It was a ghost, wearing an explorer's clothes. In 1988, Oshman sold the brand to Les Wexner's The Limited, the Columbus, Ohio retail empire that also owned Victoria's Secret, Bath & Body Works, and Lerner, New York. And then, in 1992, The Limited hired a man named Michael Jeffries. The world was about to change. 1992, New Albany, Ohio. Michael Jeffries was hired as president of Abercrombie Fitch when the brand was, by any fair measure, a wreck. It had 36 stores, annual sales of approximately $50 million, no coherent brand identity. A company that had once equipped the greatest adventurers of the 20th century was now selling hunting wear by mail order to people who remembered when it mattered. What Jeffries saw with the clarity that only certain kinds of commercially gifted minds can achieve, was not what Abercrombie & Fitch was, but what it could be. American college campuses in the early 1990s were full of young people with disposable income and a desperate hunger for brands that would signal their membership in the right social tier. Gap was too mainstream. Calvin Klein was aspirationally sexual but cold. What did not yet exist was a brand that combined the social hierarchy of prep school culture with the raw sexuality of youth at full intensity. Jeffries built exactly that. He discarded all outdoor merchandise. He replaced it with high-priced casual wear, jeans, polos, hoodies, t-shirts, produced in premium fabrics and branded with the Abercrombie & Fitch name in ways that made the label visible rather than incidental. He hired fashion photographer Bruce Weber to shoot advertising campaigns in stark black and white, semi-nude young bodies in suggestive poses, outdoors, lit like classic photography, oozing a kind of casual, entitled sexuality that had never appeared in mainstream mall retail before. He built the in-store experience around the fantasy, darkness, loud music, cologne, and beautiful employees selected for their appearance. He renamed those employees models. He opened stores aggressively. Revenue climbed from $50 million in 1992 to $335 million by 1996, the year the company went public on the New York Stock Exchange. On its first day of trading, the stock grew 45%. By the end of 1997, the company had achieved 22 straight quarters of improved profits. The brand had become something its founders, David Abercrombie with his handmade tents, Ezra Fitch with his 50,000 copy catalogue, could not have imagined. It was not selling gear, it was selling aspiration. Specifically, it was selling the aspiration of social dominance among the young, the fantasy of belonging to the right group, wearing the right label, being the right kind of person. Between 1995 and 2008, sales grew 20-fold, and net income increased more than 56-fold. But here's the thing. Built into the very foundation of this success was an idea that would eventually become a liability so severe it would help dismantle everything Jeffries had built. The idea was exclusion. 2003, the United States. Jeffries was direct about his vision in a way that most corporate executives carefully avoid being direct. In a 2006 interview with Salon magazine, an interview that would sit largely unread for 7 years before detonating into a public relations catastrophe, he articulated the brand's identity with a candor that can only be described as remarkable. He wanted the good-looking cool kids. He wanted the attractive all-American kid with a great attitude and a lot of friends. He was, he said without hesitation, exclusionary. Absolutely. He did not want overweight or unattractive people wearing his clothes, not because he disliked them as people, but because he was curating a brand image, and they were not part of the image he was curating. This philosophy was not merely stated in interviews, it was operationally embedded into the company's practices in ways that would eventually generate decades of lawsuits, settlements, and regulatory sanctions. The company's look policy governed what store employees, models, as they were titled, could wear and how they were required to appear. It was explicit, detailed, and applied in hiring decisions across thousands of stores globally. In practice, this meant that store managers across the country were instructed to submit group photographs of their employees to corporate headquarters so that Jeffries himself could approve or veto individuals based on appearance. Anyone deemed insufficiently attractive for the brand was, according to a 2010 investigation by Gawker, encouraged to be fired. In 2003, African American, Latino, and Asian American employees filed a class action lawsuit, Gonzalez v. Abercrombie & Fitch stores, alleging that the company had systematically discriminated against minorities in its hiring and promotion practices, preferring white employees for visible floor positions while routing people of color to back-of-house roles invisible to customers. The company settled in 2004 for $40 million, It was required to hire diversity recruiters, appoint a vice president of diversity, discontinue recruiting primarily at majority white fraternities and sororities, and report to a court-appointed monitor twice yearly. It had barely paid the $40 million when the next controversy arrived. A thong for preteen girls, sold by Abercrombie Kids, printed with the words "eye candy" and "wink wink." Nationwide protests, removal from shelves, an apology that satisfied no one. Then t-shirts mocking Asian Americans. Then shirts sexualizing college women. Then a Muslim employee sent to the stockroom because her hijab violated the look policy, a case that eventually reached the United States Supreme Court. The brand was not merely controversial, it was operating a philosophy of exclusion that was producing a growing legal archive, and the financial machine was still running at full speed. If you're finding this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into history. What comes next, the magazine, the backlash, and the collapse, is the part of this story that almost nobody knows in full detail. 2006, New Albany, Ohio. At the height of the Jeffries era, Abercrombie Fitch was not merely a clothing retailer. It was a sensory apparatus, an engineered environment designed to produce a specific emotional state in the people who entered it. The stores were built to feel like clubs rather than shops. 85-degree interior temperature. Darkness interrupted by precisely placed spotlights. The signature cologne, Fierce, Jeffries' personal creation, reportedly modelled on his own preferred scent, pumped through the ventilation at levels that turned the perimeter of the mall into a kind of olfactory advertising. The A&F Quarterly, a magazine catalogue hybrid, launched in 1997, combined fashion photography with articles whose editorial voice straddled the line between provocative and pornographic. Headlines like "Group Sex" sat alongside photographs of mostly white, mostly nude or semi-nude young models in situations that the magazine described as aspirational. The Adult Video News trade publication once called the company's website one of the finest softcore sites operating at the time. The company's response was essentially to accept this characterization as a compliment. By 2006, earnings had increased for 52 consecutive quarters. Annual revenues had crossed $2 billion. The company operated 800 stores and 3 sub-brands: Hollister for younger teens, Abercrombie Kids for children 7 through 14, and Gilly Hicks for women's intimates. International expansion was accelerating. A flagship London store had opened at 7 Burlington Gardens on Savile Row in 2007, to the fury of the tailors whose street it was. Tokyo followed in 2009. Jeffries in 2004 had been paid approximately $25 million in compensation. In 2008, after being named the highest-paid worst performer among 2,000 surveyed corporations by the Corporate Library, his total compensation package was valued at $71.8 million. $71.8 million for a year in which the company had begun showing signs of vulnerability to the economic crisis gripping the United States. The brand had become a genuine pop culture artifact. Kanye West had it in his songs. The band 5 Seconds of Summer would later put American Apparel underwear in a pop single, while A&F appeared in countless other cultural references as shorthand for a specific kind of aspirational American youth identity that was either everything you wanted or everything you were excluded from. But here's what nobody inside the company was adequately reckoning with. The very exclusivity that had made the brand magnetic was making it increasingly fragile. Cultures that survive on the principle of keeping people out are always one cultural shift away from irrelevance. That shift was coming, faster than anyone inside 6301 Fitch Path in New Albany, Ohio, was prepared for. May 2013. The United States and globally. The 2006 Salon magazine interview with Mike Jeffries had been published during the company's golden years. It had generated some attention at the time and then largely disappeared into the archive. nobody had found a way to make it matter. Then, in May 2013, actress Kirstie Alley mentioned Jeffries' comments in an Entertainment Tonight interview. The daytime television host Ellen DeGeneres addressed them on her program. And the internet did what the internet had, by 2013, become fully capable of doing. It amplified a 7-year-old quote into a global crisis in a matter of days. The specific words circulated everywhere: that Abercrombie was exclusively for the cool kids, that a lot of people did not belong in his clothes and could not belong, and that the company was absolutely and unapologetically exclusionary. More than 68,000 people signed a Change.org petition. A filmmaker named Greg Carber filmed himself distributing Abercrombie clothing to homeless people in Los Angeles under the campaign Fitch the Homeless, arguing that if the brand did not want poor or unattractive people wearing its clothes, giving those clothes to the homeless was the most effective boycott possible. The video was watched millions of times. Jeffries issued an official statement on May 17, 2013, expressing sincere regret that his words had been interpreted in a manner that caused offense. The statement noted that the company was completely opposed to any form of discrimination. It satisfied almost no one. The company's stock dropped. Media coverage was relentlessly negative. The brand's carefully constructed identity, the one that had powered 52 consecutive quarters of earnings growth, was now being framed in mainstream culture not as aspirational, but as bullying, institutionalized as retail strategy. And simultaneously, the financial numbers had already been deteriorating for several months. In the first quarter of 2013, Abercrombie & Fitch entered what would become a historic decline. Comparable sales, the most fundamental measure of a retailer's health, fell 10% for the Abercrombie brand and 14% for Hollister. The full year 2013 saw total company comparable sales fall 9%. After 3 consecutive years of positive growth in combined US chain stores and direct-to-consumer sales, the metric had gone firmly negative. The company's own CEO stated in his annual assessment, 2013 was a challenging year, with sales and earnings falling well short of the objectives we set at the beginning of the year. That was the public language. The private reality was that a business model built on selling exclusion to teenagers was colliding with a generation of young consumers who had grown up on social media and increasingly organized their values around inclusion, authenticity, and hostility to exactly the kind of institutional gatekeeping Abercrombie had operated as a feature rather than a bug. The empire was cracking. Badly. And the CEO who had built it was about to be forced out. December 9, 2014. New Albany, Ohio. Michael Jeffries resigned as Chief Executive Officer of Abercrombie & Fitch after 22 years of leading the company he had fundamentally rebuilt. The resignation, carefully worded as a mutual agreement, came after 11 consecutive quarters of negative comparable company sales. The company's stock jumped 8% on the day of his announcement. It was the biggest single-day gain the stock had recorded in more than 9 months. The market was not mourning his departure. By 2014, the quarterly numbers were catastrophic. Net sales for the third quarter of fiscal 2014 were $911 million, a 12% decline from the same period the prior year, when quarterly sales had been over $1 billion. Comparable sales were down 10% overall, with international comparable sales falling 15%. Every brand in the portfolio, the flagship Abercrombie & Fitch, Abercrombie Kids, Hollister, was in decline simultaneously. The proximate cause, internally identified by the company, was the collapse of heavy logo product sales. For years, the large embroidered moose and embossed lettering had been what consumers were actually paying for, the logo as social credential, the brand name as membership badge. When teenagers stopped wanting to walk around as living billboards for a brand that had publicly declared many of them not cool enough to wear it, the foundation of Abercrombie's revenue model simply disappeared. Jeffries' partner, Matthew Smith, had also become a significant internal problem. Smith had been reviewing internal company documents and consulting on real estate decisions at Abercrombie Fitch for years, despite holding no official position in the company and possessing no qualifications for the tasks he was performing. This governance anomaly had drawn increasing scrutiny from the board. According to reporting by GQ magazine, Smith's involvement was considered a contributing factor in the decision to accelerate Jeffries' departure. Fran Horowitz was eventually named permanent CEO in February 2017, taking over from a succession of interim leaders who had struggled to stabilize the brand after Jeffries' exit. She had been the company's chief merchant, someone who understood product deeply and who had watched the company's values become its greatest vulnerability. But the story of Mike Jeffries was not finished. Not even close. What was coming next was not a business story. It was a criminal one. 2003 to 2015. United States, England, France, Morocco. The A&F Quarterly had been discontinued in 2003, having amassed complaints sufficient to make its continuation commercially untenable. It had published photographs of young, overwhelmingly white bodies in states of undress, alongside articles that treated sex as lifestyle content rather than editorial provocation. The magazine's final issue arrived under protest from a public that was becoming less tolerant of content that sexualized youth in the service of selling jeans. But the culture that the magazine expressed had not ended with the magazine. It had, according to allegations that would emerge years later, continued operating in a different register entirely. Private, hidden, and far more sinister than anything printed between the quarterly's glossy covers. In 2023, the British Broadcasting Corporation published an investigation based on the accounts of 8 men who stated they had been recruited to attend parties organised by Michael Jeffries and his partner Matthew Smith. The recruiter was identified as James Jacobson, a middleman who had used promises of Abercrombie Fitch modelling opportunities to approach aspiring young men. One of the recruits told the BBC that Jacobson had made clear that participation in sexual acts with him was a prerequisite for meeting Jeffries. Those who passed this initial requirement were invited to gatherings at Jeffries' homes in Manhattan and the Hamptons, and at luxury hotels in London, France, Italy, Morocco, and St. Barthélemy. The men attending these events were allegedly required to sign non-disclosure agreements with financial penalties for violations. They were given cash payments after events, amounts ranging into thousands of dollars. They were reportedly provided with muscle relaxants and erectile dysfunction medication, and some alleged they were injected with substances without consent. Abercrombie Fitch said it had been horrified and disgusted by the allegations, and stated that it had no knowledge of any misconduct during Jeffries' tenure. In October 2024, federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of New York unveiled a 16-count indictment against Michael Jeffries, Matthew Smith, and James Jacobson. The charges included sex trafficking and interstate prostitution. Jeffries was 80 years old. He was released on a $10 million bond. Smith was detained. Jacobson was released on a $500,000 bond. Prosecutors stated that 15 survivors had come forward. If convicted of sex trafficking, each defendant faced a maximum sentence of life in prison and a mandatory minimum of 15 years. The company that had once sold the fantasy of being the right kind of beautiful was now associated with something that had used that fantasy as a recruitment mechanism for alleged crimes of extraordinary severity. 2004 through 2015. Global operations. It would be a mistake to treat the sex trafficking allegations as a story entirely separate from the broader pattern of the company's behaviour under Jeffries. They were not separate. They were the most extreme expression of a culture that had, for 22 years, made physical appearance the primary criterion for human worth and belonging. The legal archive of the Jeffries era at Abercrombie Fitch is extensive and damning in its comprehensiveness. The $40 million settlement in 2004 in the Gonzalez v. Abercrombie Fitch discrimination case had established that the company's look policy was being applied in ways that systematically disadvantaged people based on race. The settlement required extensive reform, but produced, in practice, limited cultural change. In 2009, British employee Riam Dean, who was born without a left forearm, was initially accommodated, but then told that her prosthetic limb violated the look policy and relocated to a stockroom position invisible to customers. An employment tribunal awarded her £8,013 for wrongful dismissal and unlawful harassment. In 2009, 17-year-old Samantha Eloff was denied a sales position at an Abercrombie kids store in Tulsa, Oklahoma, because her hijab violated the look policy. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission brought suit. The case went to the United States Supreme Court, which ruled 8-1 in 2015 against the company. The case's formal title was Equal Employment Opportunity Commission v. Abercrombie and Fitch Stores. In 2010, Hani Khan was fired from a Hollister store in San Mateo, California, for refusing a human resources representative's demand that she remove her hijab. The Council on American Islamic Relations filed a complaint with the EEOC. The company added to the International Labour Rights Forum's Sweatshop Hall of Shame in November 2009. Abercrombie faced a class action suit in 2002 from American Eagle Outfitters that it filed claiming design theft, and lost. It paid $6,050,000 in 2000 and settling securities fraud claims related to misleading statements to investors about its growth. Each individual case had been managed, settled, or litigated. None had fundamentally changed the culture. The culture was the brand. The brand was the culture. And the CEO was the living embodiment of both. Meanwhile, a different generation of consumers was deciding they did not want anything Abercrombie was selling. Not the clothes, not the fantasy, not the exclusion. We're halfway through this incredible story. If you're enjoying it, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support means everything and helps this channel keep bringing you these deep, honest dives into the stories behind the brands. What happens next is one of the most remarkable comebacks in retail history. 2013 to 2017, New Albany, Ohio. Beginning in the first quarter of 2013 and extending across 4.5 years, Abercrombie & Fitch experienced 18 consecutive quarters of declining comparable sales. 18. Every 3 months, in every quarter, the number that measures a retailer's core health, whether the same stores are selling more or less than they did in the same period the year before, went the wrong direction, without interruption. The cause was not a single factor, but a convergence so complete that it rendered the company's entire strategic foundation obsolete simultaneously. Fast fashion had matured. Zara, H&M, Forever 21, and a growing ecosystem of digitally native brands were offering stylish clothing to young consumers at price points that made Abercrombie's premium-priced basics look like artifacts of a different economic era. These competitors also had something Abercrombie had structurally avoided building: the ability to respond rapidly to trend cycles. Abercrombie's model was depth and consistency, the same core items, the same brand promise, season after season. In the age of Zara releasing collections that turned over in weeks, consistency read as stagnation. Social media had simultaneously transformed the relationship between young consumers and the brands they wore. The teenager of 2013 was not experiencing fashion through monthly catalogues and mall visits the way the teenager of 1997 had. They were experiencing it through Instagram, Tumblr, and Twitter, platforms that rewarded authenticity, diversity, and the visible rejection of institutions that claimed to define who was, and who was not, cool. The Abercrombie brand, with its explicit hierarchy of attractive people who belonged and everyone else who did not, was perfectly designed to be destroyed by these platforms. And it was. The company's international expansion also backfired. Flagships in London, Tokyo, and Hong Kong opened at enormous cost, with enormous fanfare, proved extraordinarily expensive to operate during a period of declining traffic. International comparable store sales fell 15% in the third quarter of fiscal 2014. European stores, hit by the broader Eurozone slowdown and by the brand's particularly sharp association with the elitism that was generating backlash, underperformed even more severely than American locations. Jeffries had refused to lower prices or offer discounts during the 2008 recession until the company had posted 17 consecutive months of same-store sales losses. A similar rigidity in the face of the post-2013 collapse meant the brand was bleeding customers while its competitors were aggressively capturing them. By the time Jeffries resigned in December 2014, the company's stock had fallen from its peak of approximately $77 per share to under $25. The man who had built the empire had also presided over its most catastrophic unraveling. February 2017, New Albany, Ohio. When Fran Horowitz was named permanent chief executive officer of Abercrombie Fitch in February 2017, she was being handed something that looked, to most retail analysts, like a patient in the late stages of an illness. The brand was culturally radioactive from a decade of controversies. The stores were too dark, too loud, too cologne-saturated, too associated with everything that a new generation of consumers had organized their purchasing behavior around rejecting. The financial numbers reflected 18 quarters of decline. Wall Street was not optimistic. Horowitz had joined the company in 2014 as its president of Hollister, then been named president of the Abercrombie brand in 2015, and eventually was elevated as president and CEO of the entire company. She had been a merchant, a product person, before she was an executive, and she brought to the role a fundamental conviction that the company's decline was not irreversible, but that reversing it would require dismantling nearly every signature element of the Jeffries era. The louvers came off the windows, natural light entered the stores. The music was turned down from 90 decibels to something a human conversation could compete with. The cologne was dramatically reduced. Shirtless models at entrances were discontinued. The title models was changed back to brand representatives, and the hiring practices that had required applicants to submit photographs for Jeffries' personal review were abandoned. The size range expanded to include more bodies. The marketing materials were diversified to feature models of different ethnicities, body types, and backgrounds. Perhaps most crucially, Horowitz repositioned the brand's target customer. Abercrombie was no longer chasing the cool teenager at the center of the high school social hierarchy. It was speaking to young adults in their mid to late 20s, millennials starting careers, building lives, needing clothes that worked across contexts without screaming their origin. The Sloan-tailored pant became a viral product on social media. The long weekend brand ethos, a reference, deliberately, back to the outdoor adventure heritage of the original Abercrombie & Fitch, resonated with a demographic that had grown up online and was nostalgic for analog experiences. The results arrived slowly, then all at once. In the third quarter of 2017, comparable sales returned to positive for the first time in years. The patient was breathing on its own. But nobody was quite prepared for what the numbers would look like by 2023 and 2024. October 22, 2024. Brooklyn, New York. Michael Jeffries was 80 years old when the FBI arrested him at his home. He was released that afternoon on a $10 million bond, one of the largest bonds in recent federal retail history. His partner, Matthew Smith, was detained. James Jacobson, identified as the middleman in the recruitment operation, was released on a $500,000 bond. All three men faced arraignment before a federal magistrate judge at the courthouse in central Islip, New York. The 16-count indictment, unsealed by federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of New York, alleged that Jeffries, Smith, and Jacobson had operated an international sex trafficking and prostitution enterprise for at least 7 years, from the end of 2008 to early 2015. The indictment alleged that the scheme had involved hiring dozens of men, transporting them across state lines and international borders, and using coercion and financial inducements to compel sexual acts. Prosecutors from the Office of U.S. Attorney Breon Peace stated that 15 survivors had come forward and described being manipulated with promises of modeling careers and paid appearances, then coerced into sexual situations at lavish private events in New York, the Hamptons, London, France, Italy, Morocco, and St. Barthélemy. The indictment alleged that participants were required to sign non-disclosure agreements under threat of financial penalties. Certain substances, including muscle relaxants and erectile dysfunction medication, were allegedly provided without full disclosure to participants. Some men stated they were injected with substances they had not consented to receive. Abercrombie Fitch issued a statement saying the company was shocked and appalled by the allegations and that it had been horrified and disgusted since the BBC investigation had first surfaced the accusations in 2023. The company stated it had no evidence the alleged crimes took place on company property and had not been accused of wrongdoing. A class action lawsuit filed by named plaintiff David Bradbury separately alleged that Abercrombie had paid off individuals who accused Jeffries of sexual abuse or harassment during his tenure. Abercrombie, Jeffries and Smith asked a federal court to dismiss that case. If convicted of sex trafficking, each defendant faces a mandatory minimum sentence of 15 years in prison and a maximum of life. If convicted of interstate prostitution, the maximum sentence is 20 years. The company that Mike Jeffries had rebuilt from 36 stores and $50 million a year into a $2 billion empire now had to decide what it owed to the people who alleged they had been harmed by the man at its center. 2023 and 2024. New Albany, Ohio, and global markets. While the legal proceedings against Michael Jeffries were unfolding, the company he had built and nearly destroyed was delivering financial results that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had watched the 18-quarter collapse. In fiscal 2023, Abercrombie Fitch Co. reported annual revenues of $4.28 billion, with a full-year operating margin of 11.3%, the highest operating margin in 15 years. The company had achieved its best operating performance since the peak of the Jeffries era, but through a strategy diametrically opposed to everything Jeffries had built. In the first quarter of fiscal 2024, the company reported net sales of $1.02 billion, the first time in its entire 132-year history that quarterly revenue had crossed $1 billion. Year-over-year growth of 22%, gross margin of 66.4%. In fiscal 2023, the stock had climbed 245%, outperforming the S&P retail sector and, for a period, even outpacing the gains of artificial intelligence darling Nvidia. Wall Street analysts who had been drafting private eulogies for the brand were now asking Fran Horowitz to explain the mechanics of the turnaround so they could write about it as a masterclass. The company set a long-term goal of $5 billion in global sales. S&P Global Ratings upgraded its credit assessment. By 2024, the Abercrombie brand had become an industry leader in its repositioned segment. Working millennials, the long weekend, dressing for the life you're actually living rather than the aspirational social tier you want to project. The stock price, which had been trading in the low 20s in May 2023, reached a high of approximately $196 by mid-2024. Here's what this story makes clear. The same brand can produce genuinely extraordinary financial results from two completely opposite strategies. Jeffries' strategy, exclusion, aspiration, elitism, beauty as social currency, worked for more than a decade. Horowitz's strategy, inclusion, authenticity, diversity, the customer as individual rather than demographic ideal, worked even more effectively and with dramatically fewer legal and ethical casualties. The question the story poses is not which strategy produced better financial returns. It is what it cost everyone along the way to discover that the second approach was possible. Return to that Abercrombie Fitch store at its peak. Not the store as it is today, brighter, louder in a different way, genuinely diverse in its marketing and inclusive in its sizing. The store as it was in 2006, when the louvers were on the windows and fierce was in the air, and a shirtless employee stood at the entrance as a living proof of concept for a brand philosophy built on the idea that some people belonged and others did not. If you look at what remains of that era, the legal settlements, the court rulings, the congressional testimony, the federal indictment, you can trace, with uncomfortable precision, the line between a business strategy and a human cost. There are at least 3 things this story teaches us. The first is about the difference between a culture and a brand. Abercrombie Fitch under Jeffries did not just have a brand, it had a culture. Internally reinforced, structurally protected, permeating everything from the hiring process to the product, to the advertising, to, allegedly, the private lives of those at the very top. Culture is more durable than strategy, but also more dangerous when it goes wrong. The company's discrimination settlements, its Supreme Court defeat, its harassment cases, its eventual criminal indictment, all of these were products not of individual decisions, but of a coherent culture that had never been seriously challenged from inside the organization for 22 years. When a culture is never challenged, it does not self-correct, it escalates. The second is about what exclusion costs over time. The short-term financial logic of exclusion is real. Scarcity creates desire. Aspiration requires hierarchy. The feeling of belonging is more valuable when not everyone can have it. Jeffries understood this with commercial precision. What he could not calculate, and what ultimately destroyed his version of the brand, was the compounding cost of making rejection the foundation of a business identity. The people you exclude do not disappear. They become your critics, your plaintiffs, and eventually your replacements in the culture. The third is about accountability and what happens when power insulates itself from it. The same arbitration clauses and non-disclosure agreements that were allegedly used to suppress accounts of misconduct by Jeffries were structural features of a company that had spent 20 years protecting its leader from consequences. The lesson is not new, but it is worth restating. When an organization constructs its systems around protecting the person at the top rather than the people in its employ, those systems become the instrument of harm. From a waterfront shop in Manhattan in 1892 to a federal indictment in Brooklyn in 2024, from Theodore Roosevelt's safari to a $10 million bond, from the greatest sporting goods store in the world to the most watched corporate criminal case in retail history. What Abercrombie Fitch is today, profitable, genuinely reformed, led by a CEO who dismantled the machinery of exclusion and replaced it with something more durable, is a real story. So is what it took to get here. Both stories are true at the same time. That is what makes this one worth telling.